Good afternoon, this is Arsenic for Tea, Part 2, Chapter 4. After lunch, only a few cold cuts of meat and salad, as the tea was planned for later, we had yet more birthday games. This time it was sardines, and even Bertie and Stephen were persuaded to join in. We went in and out and up and down the wriggling many-cornered corridors of Fallingford, losing each other and finding each other again, and bumping into Chapman and Hetty as they tidied rooms and prepared Daisy's birthday tea. In one round I was squashed behind a fat leather sofa which was shedding horsehair through splits in its lining when Stephen crawled in behind me. He looked miserable and pinched. "Hello, Hazel," he whispered. "What's up?" "Nothing," I said. Then, "This is a funny sort of birthday for Daisy, isn't it?" Stephen made a face, and all the freckles on his nose wriggled. "Awful," he said. "That man, Mr. Curtis, I don't like him. He's the reason Bertie and Daisy's parents have been arguing, isn't he?" "I think so," I said, my stomach lurching. "I hate it when parents argue. It seems like such a waste. You see, my father's dead, so when I see mothers and fathers rowing, I wish they wouldn't, that's all. They don't know what might happen." I wanted to hug him, but I was not sure whether Stephen was a hugging sort of person or whether I was the sort of person who hugged boys behind sofas in empty rooms. So I said, "Oh dear," and gingerly patted him on the arm. "It's quite all right," said Stephen thickly. "It was years ago, though I don't much feel like playing sardines any more somehow. What say we stop for a bit?" I stood up with great relief because the back of the sofa had smelled like pressing my face against a very wet and dirty horse. Daisy tried to take me riding once for 5 minutes, so I know what I'm talking about, and took a big gulp of fresh air. Stephen went over to the window, hands in pockets, sauntering like a cat. Then his back stiffened. I ran over and peered out too. We were in the little box room on the first floor, filled with old broken furniture. It looks down onto a patch of front lawn and a gravel walkway with its stone urns and little ornamental bushes. Mr. Curtis and Lady Hastings were standing there. Lady Hastings was wrapped in her fur, and Mr. Curtis was holding his gold watch. The clouds had gathered up even more, and it was raining quite hard. I wondered what on earth they were doing outside instead of coming into the dry. I knew that Lady Hastings absolutely hated getting wet. But then I saw why they weren't thinking about being rained on. They were arguing again. Snatches of their conversation floated up to us. "Rather sudden, Dennis," said Lady Hastings. "I don't see that it is," said Mr. Curtis. "Your husband, and we wouldn't want—" "Bring your jewels and the painting I told you about." "But Dennis, dear—" "Can't," began Lady Hastings. "If you don't," said Mr. Curtis in quite a different, hard voice, "I shall tell your husband up to. We'll see. Thinks, how do you like that?" Lady Hastings gasped and clutched her fur tightly around her shoulders. "Dennis!" she cried. "You have until after tea to make a decision," snapped Mr. Curtis, "and if not, well." He stormed back towards the front door, and with a gasp, Lady Hastings chased after him. Around them, the rain had become a downpour, and I could hear grumbles of thunder far away in the hills. I turned and looked at Stephen. He was rubbing his cheek, as shocked as I was. "What did he mean?" he asked. "Do you think—" "I don't know," I said. I felt very frightened. "Don't tell Daisy or Bertie." Stephen nodded. "Mum's the word," he said. "But what if—" "He won't," I said. "He can't. He'll be gone after the tea party. He said so." I wished I really felt so confident. What if Mr. Curtis did do something awful? I had a horrible feeling that things were about to go very wrong. "Can't we go down and find the others?" I asked. At that point where the main stairs turned, we paused. Below us the hall was empty, but we could see the wet tracks where Mr. Curtis and Lady Hastings had rushed through. The game had come through here too, and the hall was looking very dishevelled. All the cupboard doors were hanging open, the carpets were scuffed up, and someone had brought the stuffed owl down and put it in the umbrella stand. "Hurry!" I hissed. Mr. Curtis must be nearby, and I didn't want to meet him at all. We scampered down the stairs and dived for the safety of the library. The door closed behind me, and a moment later Stephen came running in after me. "Sorry," he panted, wiping his forehead. "I panicked, froze up, nearly caught." Beanice popped her head out from behind a chair. "Hello," she said cheerfully. "What are you doing out of hiding?" "Beanie," groaned Kitty, crawling out from under an occasional table. "You aren't supposed to give us away." "Have we won? Oh, have we?" asked Beanie. Then Daisy emerged from an impossibly small nook in the corner of the room. Beanie jumped and squeaked and said, "How did you get there?" And the game seemed to be over. Chapter 5. At 2:50 by my wristwatch, the dinner gong rang. It sounded wobbly because Chapman was the one striking it. "Ooh," said Beanie, "tea." Daisy didn't say anything, just smoothed down her skirt and patted her hair. I could see that she was dreading it. "Tea?" I said to her encouragingly. "Yes," she said, "tea, spiffing." Beanie and Katie took her at her word, but as we went out into the hall, I caught hold of her hand and squeezed it again, and Daisy squeezed back fiercely. As we went into the dining room, I felt a sort of sadness come over me. I couldn't explain it because all the electric lights in the room were blazing, and there was the most gorgeous spread on the table, an enormous teapot surrounded by lovely pillowy buns and jellies in 4 different colours, and jam tarts and ham and boiled eggs and muffins, and a fat chocolate cake with Happy Birthday Daisy piped in white icing, oozing cream. But the rain was slicing down outside the windows, harder and harder, and although Chapman had tried to tidy up and draw himself up tall, his hair was not quite combed, and he had a speck of something pale on his lapel. His hands, as always, were shaking. I knew that really, although things looked so bright, they were all wrong underneath, and I didn't know how to behave among all these strange English people. More than ever, I wished I could go home to Hong Kong, where everything was safe and understandable, and even the rain was warm. Jellies were all very well, but they weren't half as good as mooncakes. "Girls!" cried Lady Hastings, spreading her arms dramatically. She had changed into her bright green dress, and she looked like a fashion plate come to life. "Welcome to our little gathering in honour of dear Daisy's birthday. 13 years old today." "I'm 14, said Daisy. "Oh, are you?" asked her mother vaguely. "Really? Well, I suppose it does happen." "It tends to," said Lord Hastings, "especially when you aren't looking." Lady Hastings shot him a glare. "As I was saying," she went on, "I thought it would be the most lovely fun to have a proper children's tea for us to serve ourselves, just the way we used to when we were young." "I don't suppose you remember being young, Daisy," said Uncle Felix, winking at her. "At your great age. What a long time ago your youth was." "Oh, good heavens, do be quiet, Felix," complained Lady Hastings. "I'm trying to explain. We're all serving ourselves, and it will be such fun, and I want you all to absolutely stuff yourselves silly. This is a proper children's tea." I was not sure what a proper children's tea was, or how it was different from tea in our house dining room after school. Daisy, Kitty, Beanie and I all looked at each other mystified, and Daisy rolled her eyes. Her cheeks were very pink again, and her eyes were shining, but I didn't think it was with excitement. However, the grown-ups and Bertie and Stephen seemed far more pleased. They all crowded round the long table, jostling for space next to the teapot. Aunt Saskia, who was draped in even more silky gloves than usual, pounced on a plate of cream cakes as though she hadn't eaten for at least a decade, while Lord Hastings, in a rather nicer tweed jacket that didn't go with his mud-stained trousers, snatched up an enormous slice of ham. In fact, the only grown-up who held back was Mr. Curtis. He slouched fashionably, hands in his well-cut suit pockets, as though he had not a care in the world. But I got the distinct feeling that he didn't want to go anywhere near Uncle Felix or Miss Alston. Something I sensed was going on, something to do with what we had overheard in the maze. Would Mr. Curtis leave before we had the chance to find out what it was? I suddenly remembered the scene between Mr. Curtis and Lady Hastings that Stephen and I had witnessed. I shifted uncomfortably. What if Mr. Curtis didn't leave on his own? Or what if he did, and told Lord Hastings all about him and Lady Hastings, just as he'd threatened? What would Daisy do then? I hadn't told her about it yet. I couldn't bear to. "Let me know when the bun fight has died down a bit," Mr. Curtis drawled, and threw himself into one of the squashy chairs that Lady Hastings had made Chapman drag in from the library, and set out in a semicircle near the door. Then he pulled the gold watch out of his pocket, and rolled it around in his hands absent-mindedly. For a moment Aunt Saskia paused with a jam tart halfway to her mouth. As she gazed at the watch, her eyes were round with desire. Then she turned back to the tea table. There was still an absolute scrum around the teapot. I was aching to join in. It seemed a long time ago that we had been given those cold cuts. Good china clattered and clinked. I saw Chapman wince, and everyone seemed to be talking and snatching cups up at once. "Chapman, stand well back. I shall be mother and pour," cried Lady Hastings gaily. "Let me!" But everyone seemed to be ignoring her, apart from Chapman, who moved as far away from the tea table as possible. "Oh, at least fetch a cup of tea for Mr. Curtis," she said to no one in particular. "Here, oh!" "I have one." Lord Hastings turned to Mr. Curtis with a cup in his hand. It was full to the brim and wobbling. Little drips of tea went snaking down its white and gold side, and he thrust it at Mr. Curtis so quickly I thought it really would spill. Mr. Curtis snatched it rudely without looking up or thanking Lord Hastings, and swallowed it down in one enormous gulp. Then his face twisted. "This tea is disgusting," he snapped. "Ugh, foul!" "What a pity," said Lord Hastings. His lips were pursed like Daisy's when she is trying not to laugh, and he quickly turned away from Mr. Curtis and went back to the tea table. By this point, although I knew I ought to show support for Daisy, I was almost overpowered by the desire for a jam tart. I could see Aunt Saskia bearing down on the plate again, her eyes glinting and her hands outstretched eagerly. "Oh, all right," said Daisy, although I had not said anything. "Tea time, come on everyone, dig in." I heaved the most enormous sigh of relief. All three of us had been waiting for her word. Daisy grinned at me, and then she darted forward, swiped my beautiful tart from under Aunt Saskia's nose and presented it to me. "I saw you eyeing it," she said. "Oh, look at this cake, Chapman, you are a brick." Daisy was making the best of it, I thought, and I was proud of her. "We know that chocolate's your favourite," said Chapman, patting her on the shoulder with his wrinkly old hand. "Mrs. D made it specially for you. Happy birthday, Miss Daisy." We ate and ate and ate, and I got crumbs all down my good dress. So did everyone, even Lady Hastings, but nobody seemed to mind. And I was just thinking that it might be quite an enjoyable party after all, when the chatter was abruptly stopped. See you tomorrow for Chapter 6.